The sun was barely peeking over the horizon when Thomas Garrison stepped out of his dusty little cabin on the edge of the Zambezi River. He had his mug of black coffee in one hand and a pair of worn binoculars in the other. This was how every morning started for him. Alone, quiet, surrounded by the vast African wilderness that stretched endlessly beyond his front porch, and that was exactly how he liked it. No noise, no people, just the calls of birds, the rustling of trees, and the occasional roar of a lion somewhere far off in the bush. 10 years earlier, Thomas had left behind the buzzing chaos of city life in Chicago. A car accident had taken both his parents, and the grief swallowed him whole. He sold their house, quit his job as a wildlife photographer, and vanished into the place he loved most, Africa. He didn't know what he was looking for. Healing, maybe, or meaning. But whatever it was, he hadn't found it. Not yet. The only companions he had were the rangers from a nearby wildlife reserve and the wild animals he observed daily. Over the years, he learned their patterns, watched their migrations, and even gave some of them names. There was a lion he called Scarface, a zebra with a limp he named Luna, and an old elephant bull he simply called Chief. But one day, something happened that changed his life forever. It started with a storm. It was in the middle of the rainy season. The skies were dark and angry, and the Zambezi River, which normally flowed with slow dignity, turned violent. Thunder cracked across the sky, and the wind howled like wolves in pain. Trees bent under the force of the storm, and sheets of rain slammed against Thomas's cabin roof, waking him in the middle of the night. He stepped outside onto the porch, clutching a flashlight, squinting into the wet darkness. That's when he heard it. A loud trumpeting cry, frantic, panicked, not far from the river. It wasn't the sound of an ordinary elephant call. It was desperate. Something was wrong. Without thinking, Thomas threw on his boots, grabbed his raincoat and flashlight, and ran toward the sound. Mud splashed under his feet. The wind stung his eyes. He had no weapon, no protection, just instincts. And those instincts screamed that something terrible was happening by the river. As he got closer, the cries grew louder. He reached a clearing, and then stopped dead in his tracks. There, in the raging river, was a young elephant, no more than a calf, struggling against the current. Its tiny trunk barely stayed above water, and each wave shoved it farther downstream. On the bank, 3 adult elephants trumpeted and stomped in panic, unable to help. The calf was going to drown. Thomas didn't stop to consider the risk. He dropped his flashlight, ripped off his raincoat, and plunged into the river. The current was stronger than he'd expected. It slammed against his chest, pushing him sideways. But he fought, stroke by stroke, gasping for air as he closed the distance between him and the struggling calf. The elephant's eyes were wide with fear. It was barely keeping its head up, its trunk reaching toward the sky like a hand begging for help. Thomas grabbed the calf by one ear and tried to pull, but the animal was heavy and slick from the rain. The river tugged at both of them, trying to drag them under. Thomas remembered grabbing a broken tree branch, jamming it into the riverbed, and using it as leverage. Inch by inch, he pulled the calf toward the shore. His muscles burned, his lungs screamed. He slipped once, went under, and came up coughing, but he didn't let go. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the calf's front legs reached the muddy bank. With one final heave, Thomas pushed from behind, and the young elephant tumbled onto solid ground, coughing and squealing in terror. Exhausted, Thomas collapsed beside it, soaked, freezing, and shivering. The adult elephants charged forward. Thomas froze. For a moment, he thought they would crush him, but instead, the largest of the 3, a female with long curved tusks and deep, intelligent eyes, stopped in front of him. She reached her trunk out and gently touched his chest, just once. Then she turned to the calf and began wrapping her trunk around it in comfort. Thomas sat there, too tired to move, as the elephant herd slowly walked away into the mist. The baby kept turning to look at him. And then, just before they vanished, into the trees, the mother elephant looked back. Locking eyes with him for one long second, it was a look he would never forget. The next day, Thomas woke up with a fever. The river water had done its damage. He lay in bed for 3 days, barely able to eat or drink, shaking with chills. He had no cell service. No ranger could reach him in that weather. He thought he might die alone in that cabin. But on the 4th day, he woke up to a sound he couldn't explain, that there was something outside, a soft rustling. Then the sound of footsteps, big ones. Thomas dragged himself out of bed and stumbled to the door. What he saw made him drop to his knees. In front of his cabin was a pile of leaves and fruit, papayas, mangoes, wild bananas, all stacked neatly. And standing a few yards away, watching him silently, was the same female elephant from the river. The baby was beside her, healthy, alive. She stood there for a long moment. Then, without a sound, turned and disappeared into the jungle again. After that, Thomas saw them often, always from a distance. The calf had grown fast and was full of playful energy, often running circles around the herd. Thomas named him Tandi, which meant hope. Sometimes they'd leave small offerings, broken tree branches filled with ripe fruit. Once, Thomas even found a collection of wildflowers on his porch. Years passed, seasons changed. Thomas aged. His hair turned more gray than brown, but he stayed in that cabin. Part of him still haunted by the city. Part of him still healing. And part of him, a growing part, feeling like he finally belonged. He had taken photos of Tandi as he grew. From a calf barely taller than Thomas to a powerful young bull with thick tusks and a proud stride. He watched Tandi learn, play, and even challenge older bulls. But no matter how big he got, Tandi always seemed to recognize Thomas. There was always a pause, a glance, a nod, as if he remembered. One afternoon, about 10 years after that stormy night, Thomas was walking back from the river with his camera slung over his shoulder. He was deep in thought, thinking about writing a book, maybe telling the story of Tandi and that rescue. Maybe the world needed something good to believe in. But before he reached his cabin, he stopped. The forest had gone quiet. No birds, no insects, just silence, and then he heard it. Thunder, not from the sky, but from the ground. A stampede. Suddenly, elephants came charging through the trees, not in panic, but with purpose. Dust rose around them. Tandi was in front, leading the charge. His eyes locked onto Thomas. Before Thomas could move, Tandi was in front of him. Not threatening, not angry, urgent. Tandi trumpeted loudly, turned, and ran a few steps, then turned back again. He was trying to lead Thomas somewhere. The last time Thomas had seen Tandi, this frantic, was the day he nearly drowned. Heart pounding, Thomas followed. Him, what was coming, he didn't know. But whatever it was, he would never forget it. Thomas didn't hesitate. Something in Tandi's eyes told him this wasn't just a random visit. It wasn't curiosity. It was urgency. A kind of silent alarm. The same look Thomas had seen in the eyes of that young calf struggling to stay above water all those years ago. Except now, that calf was fully grown. His tusks strong, his presence commanding, and his movements deliberate. Tandi let out a low rumble, turned, and began walking swiftly into the jungle. The other elephants followed, flanking both sides of the path as if forming a protective wall. Thomas jogged behind, stumbling at times as the undergrowth clawed at his legs and branches whipped across his chest. He didn't know where they were taking him, but he knew it mattered. Minutes passed, then more. The jungle grew denser, darker. The canopy above was so thick, it blocked out most of the sun. The ground beneath his boots turned soft and damp, and the air felt heavier. Thomas could hear his own breath now, fast and shallow, as he tried to keep pace with the herd. But Tandi would occasionally pause, waiting just long enough for Thomas to catch up before pushing forward again. Then, suddenly, the herd stopped. Thomas came to a halt, panting, and looked ahead. They were standing at the edge of a shallow ravine. Across the gully, there was movement, something struggling in the mud. He stepped closer, and that's when he saw her. A young elephant, much younger than Tandi, trapped in the sludge. Her front legs were sunk deep into the swampy floor, and every time she tried to pull herself free, her body only sank deeper. Her trunk flailed helplessly, swinging toward the air, searching for something to grab. She let out a weak trumpet, the kind that made your chest ache to hear. Tandi let out a low, steady rumble. The herd responded in soft tones. They weren't panicked, they were focused. But one thing was clear, they couldn't reach her. The banks of the ravine were steep, and the mud was too unstable. Any elephant that tried to help her directly would risk getting stuck themselves. And that's why they had come for Thomas. They remembered. Thomas stared at the young elephant, then at the mud, then at the trees around them. He didn't know how they had found her, or how long she had been trapped, but he could see she was growing weaker by the minute, and there was no time to wait for the rangers or other help. He had to act. He quickly pulled off his shirt, tied it around his mouth to block the stench of the swamp, and scanned the area for something he could use. Then he spotted a fallen tree trunk nearby. Long, thick, heavy. He grabbed a thick branch and began breaking it into makeshift planks. The elephants watched in absolute silence, their eyes never leaving him. With effort, Thomas dragged the branch toward the edge of the mud, jamming it into the muck to test the stability. It held barely. He used another branch to build a small platform, just enough to distribute his weight. One wrong step, and he'd sink. But he didn't have time to be cautious. Slowly, he stepped onto the branch, feeling it wobble under his feet. Then another. Inch by inch, he made his way toward the elephant. The young female had collapsed onto her side now, her eyes glazed with exhaustion. She was close to giving up. Thomas bent down, wrapped one arm around her trunk, and whispered softly, "I've got you. Just hold on." He reached into his belt, pulled out a thick rope he always carried for emergencies, and began tying it around her front leg. The mud was thick and sucked at every movement like it wanted to keep her forever. It took nearly 20 minutes just to secure her leg. His hands were shaking, his arms burned. But finally, the rope was in place. He looked back at Tandi, raised his hand, and then shouted, "Pull." The herd responded instantly. Several elephants grabbed the rope with their trunks, working in unison. The rope tightened. The calf let out a frightened squeal as her body shifted. Mud gurgled and sucked, resisting their efforts. The rope creaked. Thomas shouted again, "Pull." The elephants pulled harder. Thomas pushed from behind, shoving against the thick slime. Slowly, the calf's legs began to emerge. One by one, her body rolled, her eyes widened. And then, with one final collective heave, the young elephant was yanked free from the swamp. Thomas fell backward, sinking into the mud himself, but he didn't care. She was safe. The calf stood unsteadily on her feet, drenched in muck but breathing hard. Tandi rushed forward, trumpeting proudly. He wrapped his trunk around her, supporting her, nuzzling her with a tenderness that stunned Thomas. The other elephants gathered close, forming a circle around the young one, shielding her from the world. Thomas, now covered in mud from head to toe, climbed out of the ravine and collapsed onto the grass. He could barely move. His body screamed. With pain, his arms were covered in scratches. His legs trembled from exhaustion. But he smiled. The elephants didn't leave immediately. They stayed with him for hours. Tandi stood closest. He touched his trunk gently to Thomas's shoulder. It was soft, grateful, like a silent thank you. And then, something strange happened. The younger elephants began to step forward, one by one. They approached Thomas slowly, cautiously, but without fear. One of them reached out and brushed his hand with the tip of its trunk. Another leaned its head toward him, letting out a low, comforting rumble. It was as if they were welcoming him, accepting him, not just as a friend, but as something more. Part of them, for the first time in 10 years, Thomas felt something shift in his chest. A kind of warmth he hadn't felt since the day before his parents died. A sense of family, of being needed, of being loved. Eventually the herd began to move. Tandi turned to look at Thomas one last time before following the others into the fading sunlight. The young calf limped slightly, but she was alive, and free. Thomas sat there for a long time, watching until they were gone. When he returned to his cabin later that evening, he found something strange waiting for him on the porch. A perfectly intact tusk, not large, but polished and old. Elephants didn't shed tusks like that. This one had been carried, brought to him, and laid carefully at his door. It wasn't just a gift, it was a symbol, a token of trust. That night, Thomas sat with the tusk in his lap, running his hands over its smooth surface. He didn't cry, he didn't speak. He just stared at the stars, and listened to the wind whispering through the trees. And for the first time since he'd arrived in Africa, he didn't feel alone. Days passed, then weeks. Thomas returned to his daily routines, but something was different now. The jungle no longer felt like a place he had escaped to. It felt like home. He began seeing the elephants more often. They came closer now. Sometimes they'd linger by his cabin in the evenings. Tandi would even rest just outside, as if standing guard. Thomas spoke to them, read to them, sang softly when the nights were long. They seemed to listen. He began recording everything, every moment, every visit, every sign of communication. He wasn't just observing them anymore. He was part of the herd. Then one morning, while reviewing some old photographs, Thomas found a picture from years ago, the night he'd rescued Tandi. The young calf was barely visible through the storm and rain, but the fear in his eyes was unmistakable. Beside it, he placed a photo from the day Tandi had led him to the trapped calf. In that second photo, Tandi stood tall, proud, and calm, not as the rescued, but as the rescuer, a full circle, a life saved, that had gone on to save another. And it wasn't over yet, because something else was coming, something that would shake the foundations of everything Thomas believed about animals, and about himself, something he never could have predicted. It had been 3 months since Tandi led Thomas to the young elephant trapped in the mud. Life in the bush had returned to its usual rhythm. Mornings filled with birdsong, afternoons golden and warm, evenings hushed and sacred, where every rustle of leaves felt like a whisper from the wild. But something was different now. Thomas wasn't just living near the elephants anymore. He was part of their story, and they were part of his. Every few days, Tandi, or one of the younger elephants, would come to the clearing behind Thomas's cabin. They didn't demand anything, they didn't even make noise. They just stand there, watching, present like old friends who didn't need words to feel connected. Thomas started leaving out buckets of water during the hottest afternoons. Sometimes fruit, sometimes just music. He'd sit on the porch, strumming a worn guitar, or playing a recording of gentle piano notes. The elephants would stay, swaying to the sound, eyes half closed. But one morning, everything changed. It started with smoke. Thomas was walking back from the river when he smelled it. Sharp, bitter, wrong. He turned toward the eastern edge of the forest and saw a black plume rising into the sky. At first, he thought it might have been a controlled burn, something the park rangers sometimes did to clear old vegetation. But this smoke was thick, chaotic, and fast-moving, and it was heading toward the elephant trails. Thomas dropped his gear and ran. He sprinted through underbrush and thorns, cutting across paths he hadn't walked in months. His heart pounded, his lungs burned. The wind carried ash, now stinging his eyes. He could hear the crackle of flames ahead, then the unmistakable cries of animals. He broke through the trees and froze. A massive section of the forest was on fire. Orange flames licked up the trunks of ancient trees, devouring everything in their path. Birds screamed overhead. Monkeys leaped from branch to branch, fleeing the inferno. And in the middle of the smoke and chaos was the herd. Tandi was at the front, pacing frantically, trumpeting orders. The younger elephants huddled close together, terrified. One of the calves was down, coughing violently. The fire had cut them off from their main trail, trapping them between two ridges of rock and flame. They had nowhere to go. Thomas didn't think. He couldn't. He turned and sprinted back the way he'd come, racing for his cabin. Inside, he grabbed his emergency supplies rope, flares, his machete, a large tarp, and a gallon of drinking water. Then he jumped onto his old trail bike, kicked it to life, and sped off. He knew the forest like the lines of his own palm. He remembered an old dry riverbed not far from the fire. If he could guide the elephants there, they'd have a chance. But it meant getting them to trust him again, this time under fire, fear, and chaos. When he returned to the blaze, the flames were closer. Trees were cracking like gunshots. The air shimmered with heat. He dropped the bike and ran toward Tandi. He shouted, waving his arms. The bull turned. His eyes were wild, filled with smoke and instinct. For a moment, Thomas feared Tandi wouldn't recognize him, that the panic had erased everything between them. But then Tandi took a step forward. Thomas pointed toward the west and shouted again. This way, come on. The other elephants stirred, confused, restless. The calf on the ground coughed harder. Thomas ran forward, unrolling the tarp and setting it on the ground as a marker. Then he lit one of the flares and held it high, careful to stay upwind. The flare's red light cut through the smoke. Tandi let out a deep, commanding trumpet, and the herd began to move. One by one, the elephants turned, following Thomas as he ran ahead, flare in hand, leading them toward the dried riverbed. Ash rained from the sky like black snow. Branches fell. Fire danced along the edges of the path. Thomas ran until his legs nearly gave out. Behind him, the herd thundered in rhythm, the ground trembling with every step. Then just as the flames surged behind them, they reached the dry riverbed. The fire couldn't cross it. The open space was wide, clear, and safe. The herd poured in, rumbling low sounds of relief. The calf, who had collapsed, stumbled in last, helped along by two older elephants. They surrounded her, shielding her from the falling embers. Thomas dropped to his knees, gasping for breath. He had no idea how long he sat there, coughing into his sleeve, watching the sky turn orange. Hours passed before the fire died down. The rangers finally arrived, dousing the remaining flames and checking for wounded animals. Thomas didn't speak much. He couldn't. His voice was gone. His strength had vanished. But the elephant stayed. They didn't leave him, not this time. Tandi walked over and knelt down, actually knelt so that his forehead was level with Thomas's chest. Slowly, he pressed his massive head forward and touched Thomas's shoulder. It wasn't just a gesture, it was something deeper, older, a bond on an oath. One of the rangers, a woman named Sifa, who'd worked in the area for 20 years, watched the moment and said something that stuck with Thomas forever. I think they've made you part of the herd. Thomas laughed through a broken breath. What does that even mean? She smiled. It means they'll never forget you, and they'll protect you, no matter what. That night, Thomas sat under the stars, again, nursing his burns and cuts. His clothes were ruined, his hands were blistered, but inside his heart, something had changed. The fear he'd lived with for years, the ache of loss, the emptiness, the sense of not belonging, it wasn't there anymore. It had been replaced with something else. Purpose, family. That same night, while lying in bed, he heard a sound outside his cabin. Heavy footsteps. He opened the door and saw Tandi standing in the clearing again. But he wasn't alone. Beside him stood the young elephant he had helped save from the swamp. And on the other side, an older bull, maybe Tandi's father, maybe just another protector. They stood in complete silence, their massive bodies barely moving. Then, without a sound, they all raised their trunks. Not toward the sky, toward Thomas. A salute, a promise. And then, they disappeared into the darkness again. After that fire, things changed even more. The park officially declared the area around Thomas's cabin a conservation observation zone. And Thomas was invited to join their board of advisors. He declined the title, but he gave them his photographs, his journals, his memories. He told them about the intelligence of the elephants, their empathy, their grief, their joy. He told them about Tandi. And how a calf once rescued from drowning had become the leader of a herd that saved not only another elephant but a man's soul. Months later, Thomas began working on a book. The title, The Ones Who Remember. And on the first page, he wrote, I thought I saved a drowning elephant, but I was wrong. He saved me. And years later, he remembered, not just what I did, but who I was. And the truth was, that herd didn't just repay him. They adopted him in a way no human ever had. And that Thomas realized was the most shocking part of all. The months after the fire passed slowly, like pages being turned one by one, in a book Thomas didn't want to end. The land healed. Green shoots sprouted where flames had once danced. Birds returned to their nests. The air was soft again, and the elephants, they returned to Dot not as visitors, but as family. Every morning, Thomas would wake to the sound of distant trumpets echoing through the trees. Not frantic, not alarming, just soft greetings. Like hellos from someone who never really left. Tandi came often. The young elephant calf he had rescued from the swamp would walk beside him. Bigger now, stronger, sometimes playful, sometimes calm. Her eyes held curiosity. She had never forgotten his face, neither had Tandi. By now, Thomas was certain the elephants saw him as more than a human. Maybe they didn't have a word for what he was to them. Maybe it wasn't something that needed a word. It was something deeper, unspoken. The land rangers noticed it too. One ranger, Nico, once said quietly, "It's like they consider you one of them. They trust you with their young. They stand beside you when they sleep." I've never seen anything like it. Thomas smiled. Neither have I. But not everything in the world was peaceful. Not everyone respected the animals the way Thomas did. One afternoon, Thomas heard gunshots in the distance. Not the warning kind. Not the ranger kind. These were sharp, rapid, dangerous poachers. He dropped everything and ran. He didn't even think to call the rangers. He knew he couldn't wait. The sound came from the northern ridge, a dry high plain, where elephants sometimes grazed in the late afternoons. It was an exposed area, vulnerable. Thomas feared the worst. When he reached the ridge, his heart dropped. 2 elephants were down. Not dead, but wounded. One had a bullet in its side. The other limped badly. Blood stained the ground. And standing over them, rifles in hand, were 2 men, poachers. They didn't notice him at first. Thomas ducked behind a rock, adrenaline rushing through his veins. He had no weapon, no plan, just rage. But then, a low rumble filled the air. Not from Thomas, from the forest behind the poachers. Trees shook, the ground trembled, and then, out of the shadowed woods, the herd came. Not running, not wild, marching, silent. United. Tandi. I was at the front. The poachers froze. One raised his rifle, but didn't get the chance to fire. With a single thunderous roar, Tandi charged. The other elephants followed. The poachers turned and ran. But it was too late. Tandi didn't harm them. He didn't have to. He cut off their escape, towering over them, daring them to move. One of the younger bulls snapped a branch like a whip, shattering the rifle to pieces. Another elephant kicked the remaining gun into the trees. The poachers collapsed to their knees. Shaking, Thomas stepped out from behind the rock, heart pounding. Tandi saw him, walked over. His tusks gleamed in the light. He stopped beside Thomas and turned to face the poachers, standing shoulder to shoulder with the man who had once saved his life. And then, the herd surrounded them. The message was clear. You don't touch our own. By the time the rangers arrived, the poachers were sobbing, unable to speak. The rangers were stunned. You found them? One asked Thomas. No, Thomas said, placing a hand on Tandi's rough skin. They did. The poachers were arrested. The injured elephants recovered. And the herd, they returned to the trees, as silently as they'd come. But from that day on, Thomas became something more. The rangers gave him an honorary position as a protector of the herd. Local tribes began calling him the one who walks with giants. Tourists whispered stories about a man who lived among the elephants, who spoke to them, who moved with them like he belonged. Thomas didn't seek the attention. He stayed in his small cabin, lived simply, wrote quietly, but he smiled more. And when he laughed, it was real. One evening, under a sky full of stars, Thomas sat by a small campfire outside his home. Tandi approached slowly, as he always did, calm, assured, massive and gentle. The young calf walked beside him, growing taller now, her ears flapping as she moved. Thomas stood. Tandi stepped forward and lowered his head, and Thomas, without thinking, did the same. They touched foreheads. Just for a moment. And in that moment, everything was still. There were no memories of grief, no ache of loss, just breath, presence. Family. Thomas whispered. You remembered. Tandi's trunk gently wrapped around his shoulder. I remember too, Thomas said, voice cracking. I always will. And as the fire flickered and the stars turned above, then Thomas realized something. He hadn't just saved an elephant. He had been part of something ancient, something sacred, a bond older than language, deeper than blood. And even when his own memory would someday fade, he knew theirs never would. Elephants would remember. Forever.